And so, wasn't that amazing? I mean, those youth, like I said before, if the future's in their hands, we're in a very, very good place. So, welcome to the final plenary session. I am delighted to introduce my guests. We're talking about reimagining diversity, equity, and inclusion, something that's on the lips of lots of people, lots of leaders, lots of people, lots of corporations, lots of organizations. I think we have to think about what our opportunities are in the current environment, given everything that's happening. And I think there are lots of opportunities. I think we focus on the challenges that we have, but there are lots of opportunities in this as well. And so I'd like to introduce my amazing panel of guests. We have Andrew Fairbairn, the CEO of SEO in London. Andrew's waving at you. We have Maya Hazel, the global head of D&I at White & Case, based in New York, and Andrew's in London. And then we have Lee Naik, who is the CEO of TransUnion in South Africa. I am delighted to have you all. Thank you for joining me. It is a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this conversation quite a bit over the past couple of days. The previous conversations that we've had, the other three panels, have all kind of touched on this subject, so I'm excited to get deeply into it. So I'm going to ask each of you to just introduce yourself a little bit, tell me a little bit about your organization and what you do, and then we'll get into it. So I'm going to start with you, Andrew. Welcome.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. What a great opportunity to be part of an interesting discussion and to talk a little bit about what we do too. So thank you for this. So SEO London, SEO Sponsors for Educational Opportunity. We are a 20-year-old charity in the UK context, which is, we've sort of borrowed the DNA from another predecessor organization in New York called SEO and transplanted it to London. We did that a long time ago, and since then, our little program that we started has grown to be a bit of a monster. I helped found it all those many years ago. India, you were one of our first volunteers, I recall, interviewing kids, and to see where we've come now is a joy. The program is now 14,000 young people across the UK who are now registered on our sites, who are reaching out for opportunities that our network can provide to over 90 different sponsor firms across a dozen industries or so. We started with roots in investment banking, but have now moved on, and we're doing everything from alternatives to traditional fund management to corporate law to engineering, technology, consulting, and you name it. We're doing something with it. The goal of the organization is to work with young people, age 15, all the way through their careers to our oldest alumni are now about 40 years old, and help them rise, and access opportunities, and give them the training they need to rise, and support them throughout that entire journey. And links all of our programs together, and this is really fundamental, is the notion of giving back. It's this notion of, it's not about you, it's about the people who come after you. So, I went through SEO in New York back in 1995, my shot into Wall Street, Lehman Brothers, and then UBS. For my part, I'm now giving back and trying to make sure that the next generation of young people is able to obtain the same level of opportunities through this newly, not so new, this 20-year-old organization. But we're changing every day, and we're innovating every day, and growing every day. We're booming at the moment for reasons we might be able to explore later on. So very pleased to be here, and thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Andrew, so much for being here. Maya, I'd like to welcome you. You're the global head of D&I at White & Case. Can you tell us a little bit about your role, what you do, and what's happening in your firm at the moment?
Absolutely. I have been at White & Case happily for over 6 years now. I oversee the firm's global diversity and inclusion strategy. I work across our 44 offices in 30 countries, partnering with our leadership, our chair, our COO, our executive committee to drive forward our strategic objectives. Our diversity and inclusion strategic plan is aligned with the firm's strategic plan, focusing on areas of recruitment of talent, professional development, retention, equitable and inclusive environment, client engagement, partner closely with a number of our clients on and support their diversity initiative. I'm also a consultant to clients in that space. And communication. If you're not communicating what you're doing on diversity internally and externally, it is really hard for it to have an impact. And I'm particularly cognizant of that as we're in the space of dealing with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, and what's our responsibility in to foster change and difference. It's been my pleasure to work with external organizations like SEO for the last 13 years, focusing on that space. And as a lawyer myself, who was inspired to enter the profession as a 12-year-old, watching the civil rights movement, learning about it, seeing Thurgood Marshall for the Supreme Court, I keenly understood that the law undergirds our entire civil, and lawyers can make a real difference. And it's why I practice to the work that I do now in diversity, to pay it forward in terms of the tremendous opportunity I was afforded having a successful career as an executive for over 7 years and launched everything, and how I'm so invested in making sure there's equal access to opportunity.
Thank you. I know there's a little bit, I ask everybody just to kind of be patient with us. This is a digital world. And sometimes, there's a little challenge with latency, which we can't control. Normally we'd be in a room together and you'd be able to hear us more clearly, but please bear with us if we have slight latency issues, which are only down to bandwidth. So hang with us. So Lee, welcome. Thank you for being here all the way from South Africa. It's coming towards the end of your day, the beginning of ours, but the end of yours. Welcome. I'd love to hear a bit about TransUnion, your career, and what you guys are up to.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be part of such an esteemed panel, having such a great conversation at the tail end of my day and the start of the weekend. So wonderful to be here. So I look after TransUnion Africa, which is 8 countries in the African continent. It's part of our global organization called TransUnion. Headquartered in Chicago, listed on the New York Stock Exchange. We're historically a credit bureau and now an information insights organization. Ultimately, what we try to do in here is use the power of data and insights to solve problems that matter. Whether it's financial inclusion, whether it's helping people deal with the new normal of digital or cyber, it's these problems that really matter in the new normal that actually have us excited. My background is working in a large American firm in strategy consulting at Accenture. I've had a lot of time in many careers helping transform organizations. I've had the ability to come on board a few years ago to this wonderful organization, TransUnion, to help us drive the transformation into this new trajectory of which the current global pandemic is actually part of that journey. So it's wonderful to be here and share my experiences being in a completely different part of the world of what works here, and hopefully lessons and ideas for the audience that's watching us today in here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lee. Again, I'm really pleased that you're all here. Very excited about this conversation. There's so much to talk about, so I'm going to hop right in. Andrew, I'm going to come back to you. And yes, I'm a huge fan of SEO. I had such a great time early on in your founding in the UK, engaging with students, engaging with you, engaging with your board. It's a fantastic organization. And to think that it's grown to 14,000 people is unbelievable. 14,000 people in the system are alumni. It's brilliant. I mean, the thing that stands out for me in that is the number of lives that have been changed because of access. And so when you talk about reimagining diversity, equity, and inclusion, access is a huge part of that. And so, I want to talk to you about something that I know you will have had to deal with, particularly earlier on in SEO, but even still now. And that is, kind of one of the ways to attract diverse talent is to change the criteria for selection, right? I mean, so, there have always been these kind of criteria around how you select candidates. But that doesn't mean lowering the bar. It means ensuring the criteria are appropriate. So when we talk about reimagining diversity, equity, and inclusion, what are some of the things that corporations should consider using SEO kind of as the example and backdrop in terms of what that criteria might look like or how people might need to think about things differently?
Sure. I mean, I think it all boils down to a sense of going beyond what you've been doing to date to find a new sort of frontier of talent, really. 20 years ago, when we started in London, it was very clear that, the five big investment banks that we were working with recruited essentially exclusively from Oxford, Cambridge, and maybe a handful of 3, 4, 5 other universities. And if you were hiring for anywhere else, that was sort of extraneous to the purpose. That world is now radically changed, and especially as we see the growth of the program and the evolution of the society over time as well. There's been a lot of positive notes that we can see. We've seen a notion that you go beyond university, you go beyond gender, you go beyond ethnicity, you go beyond socioeconomic status, you can go beyond on any front. We can do better. And so we started at SEO around the notion of ethnic diversity in the investment banking workplace. We always wanted to have gender balance. So it was always a piece of what we did. But we've made that more and more explicit over time. We've always thought of social mobility organization, but we've made that more explicit over time as well, as we've seen the more clear demand from firms to go there. What we don't do a lot of is sort of LGBT work or mental, physical disability, but we're 150% supportive of that. I mean, the goal is to go beyond. I'm sort of humble enough to just note that we can move the needle for a lot of the firms we work with, but firms have to be ready to move, and they have to be willing to shift those criteria themselves. And I recall one firm, a hedge fund, their idea of diversity was moving from hiring exclusively from the Cambridge University math department to incorporate people from Oxford, right? So they're at a particular point in a journey. And so if we can get them to be a little broader, we're moving the needle. Likewise, we'll chat with a firm that says we're really interested in doing more with ethnicity because we've been doing so well in gender so far. Can you help us? That's really where I think we need to see folks broaden out. One of the core things that sits behind all of this is a sense of mitigating factors in a young person's application and how those are captured and tracked. So, for instance, we're very clear to look at students' application forms for measures that they may have been dealing with some form of hardship as they're coming up. For example, if you're on free school meals and you're the first kid in your family to go to university, you are at a deep disadvantage to others. And if we can then look at your track record and see, my gosh, you've managed to, be the head of this and run this club and be innovative on this front and make this or that other thing happen, we exist in many respects to find in the rough who would be overlooked by the traditional recruitment systems, which are for the most part rejection systems at this point, because the volume of applications relative to the people who get through them is such that it's more about rejection than recruitment in many ways. So we're there to find those young people and help them up and through. Google gets 3.3 million applications a year, yet they still work with us because they're looking for, those diamonds in the rough. And we've put over 100 young people into Google over the last few years on the back of, our sifting and sorting and finding talent in hidden places. Sometimes it's really just a matter of effort. So I say going beyond, it's not just a matter of categories of diversity, but going beyond your existing lens and approach. One really powerful statistic that I can share, when we look at the 14,000 young people who've registered with us and ask, how did you hear about SEO London? So in the last couple of years, it's bounced between 52 to 56% have heard about us through word of mouth, as distinct from Google searches, as distinct from on-campus recruiting, as distinct from all the things that most firms do in a normal recruitment context. I think that tells me, I deduce from it, I hope I'm right, that if you're that kid sitting in that housing project, council estate, often a sort of call it a cold spot of opportunity, and you get an opportunity from White & Case or TransUnion to lands on your desk and say, hey, let's go work there. The odds that you think, that's for me, are pretty low. You were doing a cost-benefit analysis in your head as to whether or not this is something that is worth my time applying for, given that I may well just get rejected. Now, good job for the career services people, good job for the recruiters for getting that invitation into your hands. But there's a core notion of belief, self-belief, of a sense of you have the skills and training to claim those opportunities. And ultimately, just even the knowledge that the opportunity exists. Like, these things all have to be aligned. And the fastest way to do that is through a friend or a family member or someone in your community, a church or a temple or whatever the structure is of your community relations. I think that is another example of firms, an area where firms fail to go, and they could do better in sort of going beyond to achieve. So we're a tool for firms to do that, I suppose. So that's one thing we can do and support. But yeah, I think it does mean that you don't have words. I'll give a great example, and then I'll let us move on. We had a superstar. She got the highest GCSE scores in Nigeria. And for those who are not in the UK system, that's sort of like your achievement tests in high school, sort of sophomore, junior year. She got the highest score for her year in Nigeria. But when she came to the UK to study, she just went to, University of Hertfordshire, a school, but absolutely not on the radar of any of the major firms in the city for just about anything. She's now managed to find a training contract at a major firm in the city. But it was SEO that found her. SEO that sort of said, listen, you're at Hertfordshire, but you've got talent. We need to get you into the world. And so we were able to provide through our training, give her the tools, the access, the skills, the social capital, the knowledge, so she could actually break in. So I'm very excited about that scenario.
Perfect. That's exactly it. And I think there's a lot to be said about ensuring that that we're looking in the right places. That's such a big part of this story, such a big part of the equation, which brings me to Lee. Lee, I had it's so funny because Lee and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about these very subjects. And I kept on thinking to myself, I hope I can remember to ask him these same questions because there was so much wisdom and richness that came out of this. But Lee, I'm going to come to you. Especially when you start thinking about race and what racial equity looks like in these spaces. And, conversations about race in other parts of the world haven't happened as readily as they have in South Africa as a direct result of the legacy of apartheid and specific policies that were put in place to try to create equity. But you've significantly changed the racial composition of your organization. What were some of the things that you did to achieve that? And more than that, how did you manage the stakeholders who may have not necessarily been in opposition, but who may have been naysayers around what your results might have been as a result of doing that?
That's a great question. I do believe that South Africa does have a good story of how we got here, and it's a journey of progress. A couple of things worth noting is that I think as a country, we actually started to talk about things that were difficult. And as Andrew mentioned, these are very difficult conversations. So if you remember, back in 1996, we had something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We all spoke about Desmond Tutu. We spoke about these big conversations. The one thing about South Africa is we actually talk to each other across racial lines that you wouldn't see anywhere else in the world. So we didn't confront about my race and where I'm from and talk about it in a very casual manner. It was part of the healing process that started, I would say, back in 1994 up to 1996. Now, fast forward to the organization, and I had the privilege of taking over the African part of TransUnion back in 2017. The key part for me was to help people understand the business case for change. Now, you rightly said that we have a Black economic empowerment policy that specifically tries to address the difference between equality and equity, or in this case, inequity. We're to find a way to give people the different levels of support to allow us to get to an equitable society, a better life for all. The key thing I think we did really well in the journey that we've been, and those that came before me set the foundation at TransUnion Africa, but we spent a lot of time understanding what is this case for change? Why do we have this policy? To the global shareholders, the local shareholders, to the top management. We had to have some honest conversations. For many of my people that work as part of my team, some of these were uncomfortable conversations. We kept promoting the concept of safe, comfortable environments, very akin to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. a safe environment to have tough conversations. So I think the first part was to set the platform for having the conversation. The second was to lead from the front. It would be remiss of me to say we need to change, but I don't lead. Now, I am a Black Indian as part of the definition of equity in South Africa. I recognize as a leader that I'm a minority relative to the Black African population, right? We call this economically active population. So as a leader, I own this. And I talk to my people, recognizing that I am a smaller part of the inequity in the society. I'm affected, but relative to Black African, I own it. So in talking India to my people, to my leadership team, we own this together. So that's the first thing. As a leader, you need to embrace this. The second component is I have several hundred people working under me, but my immediate leadership team had to buy into this. Now, it may not make sense to them, and they could choose an alternative path somewhere else. But as an organization, we subscribe to the social consciousness that I, as a leader, had, that we as a business had the right and we needed to play in society. And consequently, I assembled a team around me that bought not into the growth of the organization only, but to the need to have a transformed organization relative to what we needed. And then finally, a key part of success is measurement. We all talk about strategy. If we can't measure success, then it's all just talk. A large part of how we did in South Africa is to specifically measure success we're having in terms of racial, gender, with different measures between us. And what's specific in South Africa is not only do we measure it internally, we have our Department of Labor, which is a government entity that actually requires us to submit an annual report showing us how we're delivering on the plan that we signed up to as leadership. So it's a combination of an enabling environment at a country level where we set the tone back in 1996, internal commitment and leadership to make the change, and continual honest buy-in and change management to make sure that we own up on the commitment we made. Because without delivering on the commitment, India, it's just hearsay and just talk.
Have to take off my, this is okay, so this is the third time I muted my mic and then started speaking. So I can't blame this one on latency issues. I can blame this one on my fingers. But that, that is exactly the point, Lee. And one of the things that I kept thinking about after we spoke the last time and just kind of hearing you again is just that there are so many pearls. People are trying to navigate how to do this in these spaces, and there is a blueprint for it, right? And in some ways, it's interesting because the West has a level of arrogance around how things should be done. And I think that we're experiencing the impact of that now in the West. But there is such a great blueprint for some of the things that we might want to consider, around how we step into these spaces and around how we start to have the conversations. And I'm going to come back to you on a part of that, because I think it's really important as we start to plan for what we do globally, as the murder of George Floyd sparked conversations everywhere. I mean, absolutely everywhere in the world, for different reasons, but it sparked those conversations. So thank you for that. And Maya, I'm going to move to you. You have global responsibility for D&I at one of the most well-known law firms in the world. And you've been in that seat for a while, and you've seen quite a lot happen. But what shifts have you seen with regard to engagement and conversations about race at work, and how might solving for the complexities of race help to kind of pull up the other pillars of diversity? Right now, the burning platform is race. I mean, it's the thing that's in our faces, but it doesn't mean that the other pillars of diversity aren't important, because they are. They're equally as important. So how might first, the question is, what are the difference in conversations that you're seeing? And then second to that, how might those pull up the other pillars of diversity?
Sure. So on the first point, the different conversations, we had embarked on a journey almost 2 years ago to say we are letting the diversity conversation be dominated by gender. And that was in part due to a business need. We were addressing where we had underrepresentation. And that was our burning platform. But almost 2 years ago, we said we really need to pivot. We need to strategically expand the diversity and inclusion conversation to one of belonging. And in order to talk about belonging, you cannot avoid talking about difficult topics. And one of those most difficult topics in an organization, in society, the third rail, is race. So Arlene Hahn, who's the partner who chairs our Global Diversity Initiative, and I, when she came on board in the role, I talked to her about this strategy, and she was fully on board and supportive, as was our chair and our chief operating officer, so covering both the lawyer and staff side of the house. And having that hard conversation about race, we knew would be a challenge, and it would be a journey. Fast forward to George Floyd, and suddenly, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Chris Cooper, Amy Cooper, that incident in the park. Suddenly, everybody was having a conversation about race overnight, right? So I have to believe from a place of optimism and faith that these deaths have not been in vain, because the conversations we've been willing to have immediately that we were so fearful of and hesitating and figuring out the best way forward, it has been transformative. We had Robin DiAngelo come and speak about her book, White Fragility, last week. And I was floored by the level of candor and level of acknowledgement and knowledge that was being spread about whiteness and white supremacy and what whiteness entails, and getting white people to understand that they are a race and that they have a worldview that is very much shaped by that race, which is so completely different from the way it has gone culturally, at least in the United States. And I think the example in comparison to South Africa, where you've had the Truth and Reconciliation Act and you've had this conversation, the United States is quite the opposite. And I wrote an American Lawyer article about this, in that we reject having those honest conversations because it flies in the face of the mythology and the narrative around us being exceptional and the story of the founding fathers. So, when you have a presidential executive order saying you can't talk about this, and an attempt to discredit the 1619 Project, looking at the root of our racial problem, right? So we know there's such a difference in willingness. But I absolutely am optimistic and know that these conversations are going to happen, and we can't stop it and we can't change it. And what's different now in the wake of the racial reckoning we're dealing with, I think, is two things: the level of empathy from those who are white, the level of allyship, the willingness to think differently. We just had a program with the launch of our EMEA Black Affinity Network and the start of Black History Month in the UK as of yesterday for October. We had a fantastic event this week where our white partners and senior business services executives read the stories of our Black employees, talking about their experiences of racism, microaggressions, macroaggressions, every type of aggression, and seeing how transformative that was, the compelling nature of storytelling, right? Having the actual stories be voiced by someone who was of a different race, right? That level of deep empathy was incredibly moving, and it got people to finally understand. And in my mind, it's why I have always done this work and never given up on this work, because I have never met a straight, white, cisgender male who, if I went to them and said, listen, this is the lived experience of this person in our organization, in our school, their lived experience as a minority. This is what it's like for them. The response has always been, wow, didn't recognize, didn't understand. What can I do? Now, mind you, I'm not saying there aren't those out there who wouldn't have that response, because at the end of the day, the ask around race and a seat at the table is about ceding power. It's about, you need to lean out so that other people can actually lean in. And that's a hard conversation for some to hear. So I don't want to be Pollyanna about it, but I'm relentlessly optimistic because of the change that I'm seeing. So that's, part one about, what's different now about the conversation about race, and it's going to continue. And on that part one, a huge driver of this, we also can't forget the generational diversity piece. So many of young white and other people of color who are not Black, who are saying, oh no, this is ridiculous and this can't stand, right? We know Gen Y, we know Gen Z, millennials, we know that their uncompromising view is I won't accept the status quo and I want to see change and I'm going to push it. The second part of your question, India, how does it pull up the other pillars? The way I've always thought about this is that oftentimes with respect to race, also with respect to gender, when we're dealing with people who are racial and ethnic minorities, Blacks in the organization, they are canaries in the coal mine, right? If you see how they are faring in an organization and they're not faring well, they're a bellwether for the fact that your culture generally is probably not healthy and good for many different groups of people who aren't in the majority, who aren't typically in the insider group. So if you solve the problem for this group that is typically most severely impacted, most likely to fall through the cracks, you will make the culture better for everybody. And we're absolutely seeing that. The solutions we're coming up with in the Black Lives Matter discussion to make sure we're addressing the challenges of those who are underrepresented in our organization are absolutely going to be applicable and helpful to other groups and absolutely pull up the other pillars. And what I'm really proud of, that I'm my organization by and large, though I get, you're not going to say it to me as the head of diversity, is the level of allyship. I'm not seeing people of color from other groups saying, well, what about us? What about gender because you're focusing on race? What about LGBT because you're focusing on race? Far from it. It is, I want to use any privilege I have to make this better, and this cannot stand. So that's how I see it.
That's awesome. I mean, there are so many things to pull out there. And, as we kind of move on to the second segment, there are a couple of things I want to just mention in terms of some of the things that I've experienced as I'm having these conversations with corporations and institutions. And a part of that is, by the by, in my experience anyway, most white people are empathetic, but don't have the language of a toolkit. We haven't been able to have these conversations for 400 years societally. So to have the expectation that you could suddenly step in and just have the conversations without any toolkit is pretty ludicrous, And so, most people, if it's not a part of your stream of consciousness in the first instance, it's just something that you don't know and that you haven't experienced. And that lived experience thing and being able to hear and understand people's experiences are the things that make the shifts. Because if you can't connect emotionally to this, then it's much harder to get folks to move on it. The second thing I want to kind of mention before I go into the second piece was the conversation about government versus business, right? And that governmentally, as you pointed out, Maya, and for those of you who are watching in other parts of the world, there was an announcement that came out about maybe a month ago here in the U.S. by the federal government, the U.S. government, which said that they would not fund in federal agencies any work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because they think that it is anti-white, to kind of paraphrase it. But what that means is that, we've still seen the march forward societally. People are still having the conversations. It gives what I think that creates is a huge opportunity for business to help lead from the front, right? Because where it can't be done governmentally, it can be done in business and private enterprise and in institutions who are not necessarily funded by the federal government. And actually, there are a lot of those. So what I'd like to kind of talk to you about and ask each of you is, when we're talking about this reimagining in spaces, mostly outside of government, and we're going to make this time in history something that we can look back on and be on the right side of, frankly. What are some of the things that we can do in business spaces at the macro level? Or what are some of the things that need to happen at the macro level in business that can be an example for the rest of for society, for government, for whatever it might be? Andrew, I'm going to start with you on that one. I know that's a big question, but I'm going to start with you.
Sure, I'm game. I see the primary opportunity for the future in all of this discussion we have is around focusing on the culture and a alignment around a culture of belonging. I think diversity and inclusion and absolutely belonging. So, what does that mean mechanically, logistically? How does that work? A metaphor I use regularly in my work is to, in chatting with firms, help them think about, where we're constantly being approached about, can we set up a program? Can we set up a program? Can we set up a program? That's great. But what is a program? I mean, you might get someone from HR and D&I to get together with, sort of a soft mandate from the executive to say, let's go build something, get a few people on board, and you have a program. It's very easy. But if that was a chair, that's two legs of a stool, or two legs of that chair. It will fall down eventually. Where I see really the opportunity there is to think hard about how we, through culture and the accretion of difference and diversity in the firm, not only do we have HR involved, not only do we have D&I involved, not only do we have an executive involved, but we have a pillar of staff, of the people who make the business tick, who are bought into this premise. I think Lee actually was describing a bit of where I'm going with this. Moving to that model where the entire enterprise is thinking not in terms of culture and not just programs. The trick is, right, if the head of HR will leave one day, executives get replaced. But the thing that sort of will allow a firm to have a culture of inclusion and belonging and diversity that endures is when it's sort of accreted, and it's something that takes time in the organization, sort of a core group of individuals who care, so that when there is a change in staff, there's still someone left behind, enough people left behind who care about these issues that they won't let the chair fall over. So I think that metaphor of the chair is something that's very important to me, thinking about programs versus culture. Another thing, again, it comes back to the question of culture inside firms. The bigger the firm, the more siloed a firm gets. And I think anyone who's worked in a big corporation will understand very quickly what that implies. We've had some really atrocious conversations with people who are trying to work on diversity and inclusion matters, but they are buried so far down the corporate hierarchy that they are in a subset of a subset of a subset of HR, D&I, grad rec, something, where I've had the call, I'll paraphrase, hey, I need 9 black people, I got 6 weeks to do it, I'll pay you $2,000 a head, right? I mean, that's ridiculous, but that's a conversation that I've had. So that's a person who has no imagination, no creativity, they're motivated in a very simple way, deep in a silo, buried. It's not someone you're going to have a useful conversation with. On the other hand, we've had some amazing conversations with people at the top of the chain. So right now we're running a reciprocal mentoring program where we're pairing alumni from the SEO London network with sort of 2 to 10 years of experience, there's thousands of them, with senior leaders at, in one case we've done it with a FTSE 500 company, another case we're doing with a leading private equity firm. And the ability to sort of now think across silos that you get when you talk to the senior leadership of a firm is magical, because all of those sort of, I've got to get my recruitment quota in place, number of people of a certain type or in place, it sort of vaporizes when you're actually talking with the people at the top of the firm, because they drive the culture of the firm. However, whether you like that or not, it comes from the execs. So I think that siloed mentality is something that needs to be broken down in the name of culture, in the name of joined up thinking, in the name of alignment. And another key thing we see again and again and again, and I'd love to hear Maya's view on this. I don't know if you know the anecdote with Stalin when challenged in World War II that the Pope didn't like him. His question was, well, how many tanks does the Pope have? Now, if you're the head of D&I, my question is, how many tanks do you have? And Maya, you were talking about you have a lot of allies that can help you get your stuff done. Being able to infuse that role, that head of D&I role, with enough power, whether that's by tanks or allies, however you want to find it. I think that's another thing we see that fails frequently, because people are given a title but no ammunition, no tanks. So those three sort of ideas, the chair, the four three-legged stool, the silos in the face of just organizational bureaucracy, and the ability of D&I to actually make a tangible difference, all come back to a central theme where I see we ought to be moving the conversation from really diversity and inclusion to one of culture and alignment around diversity and inclusion and belonging. I think one of the most powerful things I can see firms doing is, it's I think very much what was said earlier, thinking about survey the sense of belonging that you have in your firm. Employee engagement surveys. Do you feel that the different populations that exist inside your employee base feel like they have a stake in the game? Do they feel mentored? Do they feel sponsored? Do they feel listened to? Do they feel promoted? Are they getting the right training? Are they part of the value creation process? Are they part of the value delivery process? None of those things are happening. You've probably got some sort of siloed tick box, D&I with no power kind of organization, because that's a classic symptom of it. So I'll stop, but I'll just say culture. Let's get to cultural change in organizations.
Thank you. So we have about just under 20 minutes left, and I have a bit. There are lots of questions that have come in for this group. So I'm going to ask you, Maya and Lee, to answer that question just in terms of what reimagining looks like and how things might shift. Keeping in mind that I'd really like to ask you guys the questions that people have sent in, because there are some really good ones. So Maya, I'll go to you. What needs to happen?
Sure, I can go quickly. I think at its core, solving these issues, you have to look to two spaces. It's the institution, and how do we realign the culture, as Andrew just said, and it's the individual. What support does the individual need? In terms of the institution, Andrew talked earlier about recruiting, intake, and competencies. First priority, we have to be doing competency-based behavioral interviewing. We have specific competencies. At White & Case, it's expertise, tenacity, collaboration, client service, communication, entrepreneurship / global mindset. So are we asking all candidates the same questions that test against those competencies and score? We're not interviewing for fit. We're not interviewing for what I want to have a beer with the person. On work allocation, data, to the point earlier, right? Data tells the story, right? So, what are we tracking? Work allocation, fair work opportunity. We say we're a meritocracy, but why is it that those promoted, the ranks are uniformly always so homogenous in so many organizations, right? Who is actually getting opportunity? Who is working around systems to the extent we have a system and it's not completely free market? If you want better results, you have to look at how you're approaching things. And I will never underestimate the point, the need to influence and nudge, the constant nudges that come from your systemic practices and an individual. To remind people, I have to talk to our partners all the time. The legal field, I can't speak to other professions as well. The legal field is relentless about culling talent and deciding very early on who is a star and who is not. And I have to remind our partners, stars are made, not born. Who are you investing in? And FYI, you're far more likely to want to recruit and invest in someone who reminds you of you. And so if we're not getting diversity in who we're ultimately seeing at the top of the chain, that's a driver, right? So it's hard to hear that we have implicit biases or explicit biases that, result in certain outcomes, but it's the truth. And then as an institution, leadership has to say, this cannot stand. We won't accept this. It's going to count in how you're evaluated, how you're compensated. These are the measures we're going to take to address this, to be the meritocracy we claim to be, right?
Awesome.
Part of it is going to be the hard conversations, education around headwinds and tailwinds, who suffers in certain ways. And then quickly, the individual, the levels of imposter syndrome, stereotype threat when people act according to the stereotypes about them, like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I cannot say enough about the need for what India you do in the world as an executive coach. Because, we've spoken to earlier, you have to reach to people and call forth their greatness. Because we can be as inclusive as an organization as we want to be. If individuals don't have that self-belief and aren't going to go for it, they're not going to come, they're not going to stay.
So that is the honest to goodness truth. There are two things I'll pick up on that, and then Liam, coming to you. One of them is that you have to do your work before you can do the organization's work. So you kind of have to know your place in this. And the other thing I think that's a really important point that people often miss is that we focus on people, which is important, but we really need to focus on the container, the system. People will behave as the container creates, which is why when people come and go from organizations, the container still stays the same and you still have the same outcomes. It's about the system, right? But before you get to that, you have to do your personal work so that you know the part that you play in that culture and in that system. So Lee, coming to you, reimagining, what needs to happen? What you've been living it and you've been doing it. So what needs to happen for folks? What do they need to think about and what do they need to do to start to reimagine the opportunity?
Three things. One, I think we use these words on, the structure, the process, the systems. D&I should be thought of as a legacy that we leave behind when we move out of our current role as leaders. What would you leave behind that becomes part of the ways of working? And we spoke about culture. Make it part of the intrinsic DNA of the organization. When you think of ways of working more institutional, when you start to think of things that are sustainable versus ad hoc, right? That's first point. Second point is that assumption is a really bad idea when it comes to D&I. You don't need to know the answer. If you can't talk the language of Maya or have the toolkit to talk to Maya or Andrew, don't assume you need to respond to them. Listen, seek to understand before we can be understood, right? And as diverse individuals, we want to be heard. We don't need you to have the answer. I've learned this over and over again, even as a diverse individual myself. The third and final thing is that I may have sponsorship top down. I measure it so I can manage it. A key lesson I've learned is if I know I don't need to have the answer, you start to leverage the grassroots movement of the organization. If you don't have the answer and you tell your people, why don't you co-create it with me? In my business, I have many working committees on transformation, on equity, on collaboration, even contemplating ways of working during work from home. It isn't told to the people because we live in an ivory tower. Let's co-create the outcomes we want based on what we collectively want for our organization and or our society.
Wow. I mean, that co-creation thing is a big deal. And that one, I think, and of all that I'm kind of thinking right now, that pearl around engaging your people to create the solution and not deciding what the solution should be top down and trying to get people to do it is huge. And I think it's one of the bases of actually successfully doing equity work full stop. Right. And I think, people often they don't know the difference between equity and equality, and the words are used quite interchangeably, right? So equality is kind of that nirvana thing. And when I say actually justice is nirvana, but then if you come one down, you're at equality. And the road to that is equity. And so, that's that baseline of ensuring that everybody's included in the solution is huge to being able to get equity, equality, and then justice. So I'm going to go to questions. There were some audience questions, some great ones that I really loved that my wonderful moderator pulled out. Lee, I'm going to come back to you actually, because it's on the back of something you just said. And the question was, you mentioned safe spaces and being able to have difficult conversations about race. How do you create them? It's a really interesting question. And I know that's loaded, but yeah, I'll leave that one with you. Let's see what you have to say.
It's really interesting because it's a parallel approach. I can't dictate to my people what's the right approach. I can't tell you to and force you to have a chat with me about a hard topic. In our business, we have different levels. For example, we have a manager cafe only with managers where managers can talk to each other about tough topics. We have a day once a month where you can request time with a colleague, with a coach that can talk to you about diversity. You've then got HR, then you've got leadership. So the answer is not so simple. The answer, you need multiple approaches to afford employees the best opportunity to engage with you on a topic sensitive to them. Remember, in the world that we live now in, the employee and or the consumer will choose the channel and the context in which to have a hard conversation. So where possible, make multiple channels available to them at different levels of hierarchy or different methods, be it digital, chatbot, physical cafes, to make this happen. Options are the best way to get the maximum impact. You can't prescribe success from a method perspective.
No, that's that. I mean, I think that multitude of things kind of going across is wonderful. So thank you, Lee. Thank you for that. Maya, I'm going to come to you. The question was, though many aren't talking about, excuse me, this is about allies. You said, though you've mostly seen allies, how do you engage the quiet dissenters who won't say what they are really thinking because of the momentum around the conversations about race?
This is what keeps me up at night and what I keep raising to our chair and our leaders. What about the people who don't agree and don't feel they have the space to speak? I'm not interested in preaching to the converted. I want to engage those folks in conversation. And so we've just been brainstorming about the best ways to approach that. I will do the personal outreach to the suspected to say, what do you think? Safe space, not here to judge you. And I think I project that. I'm not here to shame and blame and label you. I ultimately want you to see a broader view. And so it goes to the creating the safe space question. And I think you have to acknowledge it. I think I also try to proactively share messages that address what concerns them. That diversity and inclusion is not a threat. It is not about a redistribution, an unfair redistribution from one group to another. It's not a zero-sum game. This is a business advantage, a personal advantage. It's going to make you better to become more culturally competent and a more inclusive leader. You're going to have far better results. We're going to increase the size of the pie that everyone shares in. Look at the world. Look at what our clients are saying. Look at what the world is demanding. So don't be left behind. I'm trying to paint as attractive a picture as possible of the benefits of buying in to inclusion. But you have to address those people. You can't just let them go and say, everybody get on board or get left behind. It's just not going to work because we're seeing the terrible impact of the backlash. And I don't want to get away from the other questions, but it reminds me of an incredible quote I heard from Gloria Steinem, that we're in an extremely dangerous history point in history that she analogizes to if someone is in an abusive relationship. The most dangerous time is right before they leave and right after they leave. The world is changing, right? Diversity is just happening, period, whether you embrace it or not. But the backlash to it that is so dangerous. And so you have to diffuse it. I think it's an important priority in the DEI conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is key. It is happening, right? There's nothing we can do to change any of that. It's going to happen. It's happening. And I think that's a part of the tension we're feeling globally, right? We're feeling that tension everywhere because I think in most countries in the world, there are those stratifications, right? It's not homogenous anywhere, and for different reasons, right? And so that brings me on to, thank you for that, Maya. That brings me on to the question for you, Andrew. There are a lot of people who've gone through your program. How do you maintain the integrity of messaging consistently within that group, given the numbers that you now have? So given that you now have 14,000 people and you're very clear about your mission, how do you maintain the integrity of messaging amongst that population, given that you now have 14,000 ambassadors out in the world, in the UK?
I talk and I talk and I talk. I mean, it came over about 4 years ago to take up the executive seat, and I found an organization that, frankly, was not as robust as it might be around issues of culture and mission. It sort of drifted a little bit from it, and I was surprised, I'll be honest, that I had to state again and again what our mission and values were. To me, it's self-evident, the value proposition, but it's very clear that it wasn't for a lot of other people. And people can become cynical along the way, whether that's the alumni of our organization, the students, or whether the organizations we work with. And so I've found myself repeating myself over and over again, and I found that that's perhaps the most powerful thing I've done in the last 4 years, is to talk about culture, to talk about the social mission of the organization, to get people lined up around the values of giving back. What we find is that when you give people an opportunity to give back, they do. They want to. I think there's so many of the people who we work with, who have seen an opportunity for themselves, not reflected in the world around them, and just buy into this mission of giving back. But we have to sort of constantly refresh it because it does erode. And so that's probably the simplest way I can say it is I just keep talking about mission and values. And it has been wonderful to see not just the total number of the 14,000 registrants on the system, but the 8,000 alumni, plus the 40,000 people following us on LinkedIn, who are all sort of interested in hearing from us and interested in giving back. I mean, SEO London is booming right now, and the reason for that, in my mind, is that it's the alumni who are calling in, or they're, great example. We had a young woman. She'd gone through the program a number of years ago. She was living in Singapore. She was on the diversity and inclusion committee for a Swiss-based private bank asset manager. And their leader of that program in Geneva called us in London to say, can we have a talk? Like, that happens all the time. I have 2 or 3 calls a day on that basis of alumni reaching out. And why? It's because I think they see, that they see the times need action. But moreover, we are creating a vehicle for people's action. Since the beginning of lockdown, we've run essentially a virtual event, a bit like this, almost every single day. We've attracted thousands of people, alumni, undergraduates, and others to the mix. And so that's the forum. So I keep talking and talking about values and culture and this and that and the other. But I try and do it as widespread as possible. And the results are real.
Perfect. So we have like 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you, and this is really like 30 seconds. I'm going to ask each of you just to give me your charge for people. What do you want people to do when they leave here after having heard what you said? Just your kind of 1 minute, this is what you need to do, this is what I'd like to see. Lee, I'll start with you.
People need to realize that there's value in diversity. If you don't understand this value in diversity, put in the effort as a leader to understand the value. And when you start to think about diversity, you need to understand that when you understand the value yourself, it'll give you the energy to deal with the challenges that come with leading an organization, the transformation of DE&I. So start with the value in diversity, get to grips with yourself, find the energy. Energy will take you through a journey that's unknown, it's uncertain, but you need the energy. So start with yourself, put the effort in yourself.
Thank you, Lee. Maya, your charge.
Engage someone who you don't think agrees. Do not buy into cynicism and cancel culture. I am my ancestors' wildest dreams. The least I can do is have hard conversations with those who don't agree.
Awesome. Andrew, your charge.
I will be very tactical. I'll say, just because of the world that we inhabit as an entity, I'll encourage all employers out there to move beyond just recruitment at the early careers as a solve to the wound, and focus very much on what some of the other panelists have said around promotion, retention, leadership, development. Give people an opportunity to grow, and you will be amazed at what they deliver. It's astounding. You give someone a little bit extra run room, a little bit of trust, and they're going to reward that, and they're going to stick around, and they're going to change your business.
That is that's it. I mean, you guys, I think you've summed it up. I just have to say thank you so much for sharing all that you shared today. I think, it's wonderful to hear from both a D&I practitioner, but also to leaders who are driving organizations. I think Andrew and Lee, you may get lots of applications to your organizations as a result of these conversations, because you're truly inspirational in the work that you do. And I just thank you for sharing. I know that it is now 12:30. We have come to the end. I appreciate your being here. I'm going to go to a close. This has been tremendous. It's been a tremendous, tremendous 2 days. We're going to zoom to me in just a second. I'm going to say goodbye to my wonderful panelists, and I'm going to close out the day. So the Town Hall Summit 2 is now over. Can't believe it. It's been an amazing 2 days. Austin, can we zoom to me, please? Thank you. Thank you. It's been an amazing 2 days. And I'm really grateful to everybody who's participated over those 2 days. We started off yesterday with an amazing fireside chat with myself and Steve Pammon, the COO of Parkwood Entertainment, Beyonce's massive multimedia company. And then we went into the CEO Spotlight, Best in Class, with Jeremy Awori from Absa Bank in Kenya, and Ruth Harrison from ThoughtWorks in the UK, and Carrie Putnam from the Sundance Institute in Los Angeles. Amazing conversation. We had the Youth Are Watching Part 1. We got to see amazing youth activists from around the world talking about their expectations for what they want us to leave for them. And then we talked about the myth of hard to find diverse talent as a close for day one. And I think that, Valerie Rainford and Mula Makobo Amagashi really busted the myth of hard to find diverse talent. And then today, here we are. If you were with me for all of the day, you will have seen a treat. We started the day with Melanie Trotman, formerly a journalist at the Wall Street Journal, who's now the chief editorial consultant and vice president at Edelman, talk with Lisa Ross from Edelman, Jaap Venema from USP, and Jim Taylor from BoardSource. I'm doing all of this off my memory. You can tell that I've been steeped in this. Tremendous conversation about maintaining and building trust during crisis. We saw part 2 of our youth documentary, again with amazing young people who are our future. And now here we are with finishing up with Reimagining Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It has been a pleasure. I will see you in March of next year. The next Town Hall Summit is in March. You have to wait for another 6 months or so before I can do it. It takes about that long to get this stuff together sometimes. But thank you for joining me. Thank you for participating. The recordings will be on the website, thetownhallsummit.com, in a couple of days' time. Go back and watch anything that you've missed. And until the next time, see you soon.